And we are live. Really excited to welcome Marnie Gelbart to today's episode. We are on episode 63 called Science Meets Society, Closing the Genetics Knowledge Gap. Marnie Gelbart is a geneticist and director of programs at the Personal Genetics Education and Dialogue Program in the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School. We're so excited to have you, and we would love to hear exactly what all of that means. But before that, Marnie, what is on your mind?
What is on my mind today, not lunch, is survival mode with the work that we do, and we'll get into that. But given the current landscape, we need new sources of funding. As I think we'll dive into, the issues that we address are so common. People encounter genetics in so many ways, often unexpected ways, and if our organization can't weather this storm, then we can't serve the people who we've helped for years. So that responsibility is squarely in my lap, and we're working really hard to change that tide.
So it's really interesting. You have it's an interesting point that you're making, is that in many ways the role, I would guess that the role that you play has become more important because you need more people to understand how important these topics are. So
Yeah.
is that how are you sort of coping with the changes in the environment?
There's day by day and hope. I mean, there's a lot to be hopeful about in any situation. Finding ways for hope is finding, ways to navigate the current challenges. And I think throughout, when people in challenging times, far more challenging than mine, when they share their stories, it's amazing. The ways that beauty and hope are still, shine through. So
just diving into a little bit of the details, is part of your role to also educate lawmakers, or is it mostly like there's the general public and then there's those other public people, public personalities?
Yes, I think the answer I usually give is not the one that marketing folks like, but it's everybody, right? The technology is going out into the world. I mean, I'm based in a department of genetics, and I am a geneticist. This technology is game changing in so many ways, with possibilities for transforming healthcare, creating drought resistant crops and thinking about climate. Applications in like conservation, extending lives. It's amazing. So the technology is moving so much faster than the conversation. It's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here with you today. The conversation and the knowledge gap, it's two-way. So it's both information about genetics, and I'm a geneticist. I love the nuts and bolts of A, C's, G's, and T's. But really, what do you need to know to make informed decisions, to ask questions, just to be confident? Like, genetics is something I can talk about. So that's really what the place that we live. But then reciprocally, what do scientists need to hear from the communities that we serve? And we learn so much doing this work. Eric, to your question, we have done 6 briefings on Capitol Hill to engage with lawmakers and bring experts in science and bioethics to the Hill to be sharing knowledge. The way that we've approached that is a bit different. I think Capitol Hill is inundated with people who want things. They are advocating for a law, they want money, or they are complaining, and for a lot of very good reasons, often. But we go just to engage in a conversation, and to share information. And sometimes they'll reach out and say, "Oh, I do have a question." People often have a burning question about genetics, I've found. They just don't know it until you get into conversation. So
What do you find right now, Marnie, what are the topics that people are most interested in talking about in the genetics world right now?
So outside, like when we go out into the world, people talk about ancestry testing, 23andMe, CRISPR gene therapies, CRISPR, like the kidneys from pigs that are being they've been modified with CRISPR so that they're less likely to trigger an immune response and are being used to address organ shortages, and so being in early days of trying to transplant into humans. But people see headlines in the news. I mean, then there's the stickier topics, where, people are thinking about genetics, and what does genetics not just have to do with my health? Health is a really big one. But not just my health, but like who I am, the things that I like, how far I got in school. And it's the standard answer for a geneticist on any of these things is it's complicated, and then a much longer response. But that's the reality, is that our so many genes and our environment influence, something as fundamental as health. It's hard to pin down in one of those Punnett squares that my daughter is studying right now.
So on the health side, as you're talking about that, I'm just curious, do the medical professions, and I don't mean like geneticists and, people who this is their like primary focus, but the average internist, etc., how well do they understand how genetic testing can impact understanding people's health, as opposed to, so there's obviously, people are going to turn to them to understand more, but they may not actually know that much about what they can do.
Right. It's like any community medical professionals are not a monolith. So right. At one extreme, you have people who, like genetic counselors and medical geneticists, who are specialized in that area. They are not nearly enough of them to meet the demand. And so then on the other end, you have physicians and healthcare providers who graduated from medical school before all of this revolutionary technologies came online. And so they're doing the best they can, through continuing ed. But like anything, the world is really crowded. Doctors have a lot coming at them. And so, where it is in the priority list may depend on their own personal interests, the kinds of where they are, the issues that patients come in with, access to resources, all sorts of things. So there's a gap there too.
And so often the word revolutionary is used when this technology, right? Especially when it comes to health. This is going to be revolutionizing our health. Please talk to us about that. Like, where in the healthcare can we see big wins, right? Our healthcare needs any win we can take. Where can we see the big wins, right? And on the other hand, where can we see big cautions?
Yeah. Oh, great question. And as soon as I said the word revolutionizing, I thought, I don't use that word very often. One of the amazing the technological advances that really drives the work that we do is advances in genome sequencing. So reading the DNA from an entire human genome was first accomplished in 2003 to the cost of $3 billion, and it took 13 years. Now we're talking about hundreds of dollars, and a full genome can be read in a matter of hours. What that translates to in healthcare, you could have a baby born with a really serious medical condition, and rather than running a lot of individual genetic tests and taking weeks to get the results, that they actually have made it so speedy that there's some analysis that can be done within hours and trying to find answers that may actually, sometimes a diagnosis is it's important information in and of itself. It brings some peace that there's something we can call this medical condition. On and in some cases, it actually can help drive care decisions and can be life-saving. So it's pretty remarkable. Similar uses of genome sequencing technology are cancer therapeutics and more tailored medications to really address the source of what's driving a tumor's growth, rather than the really toxic kind of chemotherapies and standards that we've been used to. And then
One thing, the way I feel like the precision and personalized medicine has been like a year away for like a 2 decades. Decades.
Yes.
Why?
And
so you're talking about the cost of the genome, full genome sequencing for a person, and I remember was a couple years ago it was like $1,000 was the target, and now we're talking probably closer to $100, $200. Why doesn't everybody just get their genome sequence? Why isn't that just a standard? I mean, that's probably cheaper than your average blood cholesterol test or something like that. So.
Right. I mean, we're getting close to that point where that is a question. I think there's probably a lot of implementation issues. There are huge issues of trust, and the field of genetics has a history of eugenics and like, more recent and current issues where people don't trust, to give their DNA. You get one genome, might have little changes over time, but there's huge privacy issues. Could this information be used to discriminate against me? There's some laws that address that, but no law is perfect. And what do I do with that information? Do I want it all? What information do I not want? Would you want to know if you were genetically at a much higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? For some people, that answer is yes, 100%. It would help me plan. I know how to live my life. I might get long-term care insurance. For some people, they're like, I have enough anxiety. I don't need another thing to worry about when I lose my keys, right?
Right.
So there's a lot. There's some reason, but there are some people who are looking to see, just to see what does it look like when every baby is born.
Right.
What would it mean to have their whole genome sequenced at birth and just accessed at particular times during their care? It could be where it's going. I don't know for sure.
So it's really fascinating. Well, as you're talking about this, my brain is sort of thinking about, obviously we have multiple different technologies that are kind of going through these massive, changes all at once. And the one that we end up talking about a lot is AI. So interested to hear like how is the sort of the AI revolution and this genetic revolution, since we're using the word revolutionary today, how are those two interplaying from your perspective? Or are you focusing a lot on how the two are being used in conjunction to get together, or is that just sort of like we're not quite sure yet?
I think we need to think more about that, and it's just a matter of so many things on our plate, but there are definitely interfaces. I connected recently with someone who's recently started an effort with a similar spirit to ours, but in the realm of AI. And we've been thinking we should definitely collaborate and trying to figure out how. And I think it could be exploring those intersections.
Yeah, it seems like there's the potential for using that kind of genetic data along with machine learning algorithms and it seems limitless what could be possible. That maybe human scientists are like they won't be able to see the patterns that are actually there. So it'd be fascinating.
Well, what's really interesting about this as a particular problem is that in most cases, when you're dealing with AI and so forth, you can't get the whole data set. And so you're trying to predict into that. But in this case, we're actually at the point where we might be able to get the whole thing. Like we might be able to get
It's mapped out
everybody's.
right? It's mapped out in the right place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I think we were talking, Jeff and I were talking to a group recently in the rare disease space, and they're trying to they have one particular rare disease that is personal to them. And they're trying to, follow up on genomics and transcriptomics and so forth on that. And they were talking about like, what happens if we could get all of these, GWAS, genome-wide association studies together for all these diseases, et cetera. And I think there's an actual real human benefit to being able to take that broad sort of whole population view of something. And I think that's a really exciting prospect.
Yeah. Maybe that comes back to what Elena was asking about the concerns. One is just, and I think like you said, I can't remember who said it, maybe you, Eric, about how this revolution, this precision medicine, it just keeps seeming like a year away. And that's a real danger of over-promising, to talk about the process of science. And, you can be anticipating, that you're going to get one result or a certain time frame, and sometimes things take much longer. It's more challenging to navigate. When it comes to reading DNA, which is really DNA sequencing, we're learning a lot. And so we don't always know how to interpret those results. And, people often want a yes or no answer. Well, genetics usually gives, more like a rheostat. It's a higher risk, lower risk. So I think the interpretation and what does it mean to get a variant of unknown significance, and that can be really stressful, right? That we found something, we don't know how to interpret it. And that tends to happen more. What we know most of the genomes that have been sequenced are people of European ancestry, and that means that we actually are better able to interpret findings for a variety of reasons. Other concerns though, if you could do GWAS, and you have all these genomes, what are you doing GWAS for? Right. GWAS has been used for health in really powerful ways. There are questions about the predictive value. Sometimes it's really small differences, and in a world where not everybody has access to healthcare, there's some pushback on that. But also, what if you get into traits like educational attainment and or sexual orientation? And these studies have been done, but have been very, very controversial. Both often part of it is how do you communicate about that, because the potential for misuse, the reality is the answer comes back, it's complicated and there's a lot that you don't know. There's environment. Does it mean that science could still be misused? Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, as you were talking about the point you made about most of the genomes that have been sequenced have been more in the European population. And actually, I was at a presentation or discussion, it was probably like a year or so ago, and they were talking about this very issue, which is that in some way, there's a number of reasons why not having a broader view of the sort of human genome is problematic. One is that you don't understand what's going on, with all these other populations, which happen to represent like a much larger portion of the people in the world. But also, it was like, to some extent, you can't, if you don't have the diversity of genomes, you're sort of missing out on all of this information that could be helpful to understand, what are the, sort of things that cause diseases and or drive certain outcomes or whatever it is, because you're just missing all of this, all of this information and diversity. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I thought that was a sort of a fascinating.
No, that's spot on, that you're missing a lot of information, both that can help specific populations and just more generally can unlock insights that can drive drug discovery for something that affects people more broadly. And I would say that that is both true. And then there's another thing that's also true, and they're really hard to hold together, but they are both true, which is that people at a genetic level are more than 99.6% similar.
Yes.
And so the difference is, genetics shines a spotlight on difference. And when we talk about, diversity in genomics, it almost seems like that supports the idea that people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds are genetically distinct from each other. That actually doesn't play out when you do comparisons of any two people from any two different parts of the world. They're about as genetically the same as one another if people are from a similar geography as from really different ancestral backgrounds. So it kind of amplifies this idea that there's more differences.
Right. That needs
interesting. So I have another question, Marnie. It's kind of along those lines, but any innovation, right? We want to make sure as a society to keep it on the right side of the equation rather than on the wrong side of the equation. And therefore there are laws, there are regulations, right? There's some kind of societal norms. Where do we stand on that vis-a-vis our genetics development?
In terms of laws, I think, the science tends to go, far ahead of developing policy. And again, a lot of what drives us is that there is no perfect policy, and having education is also a kind of protection. Something like CRISPR, there's different laws in different nations. And so, in some, I think policy is really heterogeneous globally. In the United States, there's some reproductive genetic technologies, how can you select, say, some families, if they know that there's a high, that they have a history of Huntington's disease in their family, that they might want to use genetic technologies to do genetic testing on embryos created in vitro, to decide which one to implant into the womb. And so, can we avoid passing down Huntington's to the next generation? In the United States, there aren't laws about that, but in some nations, that's illegal, or in the UK, you have to go through a special process to get approvals on, I think I don't know if it's case by case or more likely a condition by condition.
Right. Well, it's such a slippery slope, right? Because what becomes a trait that you will want to not, one thing to be Huntington's disease, but at some point do we start knocking out traits that are actually just, things that are just, somebody decided was socially undesirable, or something that is not a problem, is not a real challenge. Well, before we're flying through time as usual, and I want to ask you, because we always like to have ChatGPT jump in and ask questions. Actually, sometimes I use other LLMs, and I tried Perplexity. Its questions were super weird, so I went back to ChatGPT. It was what I've noticed with Perplexity, I always ask, what are 10 funny questions you can ask somebody who's an expert in whatever, and Perplexity likes to do dad jokes. So that, that doesn't work.
My dad was a geneticist. That could be interesting.
I could come up with
Perplexity knows who is asking.
I could too, but anyway. All right, I have two questions for you. I usually ask, do you want absurd first or thought-provoking first?
Oh. Absurd.
All right. This is not that absurd, but it said, just sort of fun, have you ever used your genetics knowledge to win a family argument? Be honest. That's what I didn't say that. It said.
Oh my gosh. think yes. Maybe
Yeah.
last night.
Maybe.
I think for family boundaries, I maybe should stop it there. But like just last night.
We love that it was last night. That sounds like it's fairly frequent. All right, my other question for you, which is maybe a little more thought-provoking, is what's the weirdest misconception someone's had when you told them you work in genetics?
Oh,
that's interesting.
It can be a real conversation ender. And then to say that I work at Harvard at Harvard. And I think for some people that's really exciting, and they have a lot of questions. But I think sometimes, there's a perception that we can't have like the rich conversation that we've just had. We don't all need to have like a PhD, or even, even anybody can have conversations about genetics. I have fantastic conversations with my kids who are 11 and 14. And I think relatedly that people often imagine about the scientist in the lab. We've seen the movies, Nefarious Purposes. The scientists I know, they do this because they care. Like, compared to industry, people in academic science are not making big bucks. They are working like tons and tons because they love it, and because they want to identify answers to problems that people have.
And I think that's sort of going back to the original part, a very early part of our conversation, I think it's a really important point, right? Is that these scientists that are, getting sort of a bad rap in this weird, climate or whatever. And I say climate, that's sort of ironic, right? Like that's a perfect example where scientists get, who are just trying to do good science, or, get a bad rap as well. But I think that's really cool.
So I want to jump in back to the ethics question for a little bit, because you've touched on insurance and ethics, and actually, I mentioned before, and you've mentioned 23andMe, 23andMe. Here's all of this data that people have voluntarily handed over to 23andMe, and now 23andMe is for sale because has gone bankrupt. At least that's my understanding of what happened. And so that's one ethics question. And then, like, how are the insurance companies going to use this in improper ways? How do you prevent, when you've given your genome over to a for-profit company, that they don't sell it to the insurance companies? I don't know. These are things that until January I would keep me up at night. Now they seem more quaint.
Right, but a lot of people are worried right now about their data. I know people who have deleted their data. I assume that data is backed up. I don't know what the practices are for really removing something from what is sold. I assume that they have practices in place to guide that. But like, where does it go? And I think this comes back to, like, why aren't we sequencing every genome? I think people have a lot of questions, and it requires a trust in the institutions, whether that's a for-profit company or a research entity or a government entity, like that trust comes into play. And so there's big challenges there. I heard something from a genetic counseling student the other day that kind of also blew my mind, was that when his dad heard, I think, the headline, "Delete your data," regarding 23andMe, his dad didn't want to have, I think it made him less trustful of anything regards to genetics. And so for him, there was more just distrust of genetics as a whole, beyond just the 23andMe and whether I choose to give my data to a company, which is concerning. And how we message and communicate really matters.
Well, and it's so fascinating because it's so interesting, because we are at a moment in history where what we could do if there were trust and people and these institutions really were trustworthy, the things that we could do would be incredible. And yet I think the trust in institutions I think particularly right in this moment, but just in general, even, over the last, probably 25 years or so, has just become so much less because you have these, I mean, we're talking about genetic data, which I never really thought of in this, but, it's your bank data, it's your credit card info. I mean, I have had to replace credit cards, probably 2 times in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Because somebody breached the data. So there's no trust of, not only is there no trust of what people are going to do with the data, there's no trust that people are actually safeguarding the data, that, people who, like banks or whatever, who in theory have relatively, positive, intentions, but then somebody hacks the information, whatever. And so it's just,
well, and it's not even clear that everybody has good intentions right now. I mean, the misuse of data seems to be the sort of zeitgeist of the moment right now. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to come back to what you were asking before, Eric, about insurance, there's a law called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that was passed with massive bipartisan support, I think over a decade ago now. And the idea is to protect people against discrimination based on genetic information, and whether that's a DNA sequence, a genetic test, or that's family history. But in both the context of healthcare insurance and in the employment. But that doesn't say anything about long-term care insurance, life insurance, schools, all sorts of things. So
greater social context that becomes also very meaningful.
Yeah.
Is in European countries and other countries where they have more state-run, Canada, Europe, other countries where they have more state-run healthcare, is there a different feeling about this? I mean, the U.S. is somewhat unique in industrialized nations as to how cruel we are about our health insurance, but is there a different feeling about this in Europe, or is it, I don't know, definitely there's mistrust in Europe of data. They have very strict laws on the privacy. So.
And maybe those strict laws actually, I mean, I'm just it's just conjecture, but that those laws maybe give people some more feeling that my data is safe.
Right.
I know that the UK has a huge genome sequencing program that's being implemented through the National Health Service. That's very different, right? And then integrated into standards of care. I think those kinds of models are explored on smaller scales within healthcare systems in the United States, but there's a lot more complexity because it's not, we're not nationally centralized, and and how that actually gets implemented in the clinical level is just, there's less control.
It's interesting. I was reading a book probably about a year or two ago, and so it's a little bit outdated, but it was called AI Superpowers, and it was all about the difference between sort of how AI was developing in the US versus China. And it was interesting. It was written by a Chinese national, so it may have had a little bit of a bias there in terms of, but what they were talking, one of the things that the author was talking about was this idea that because there's not the same assumption about the government, leaving you alone and whatever, that there was much more openness to sharing data, et cetera, in the Chinese market, which is why we're seeing some things happening in the Chinese market where there's sort of leaps and bounds that maybe were not happening as fast in the US market. And I wonder, it'll be interesting to see be interesting to understand how that sort of view of, to your point, in Europe, there's maybe more trust because there's more laws, and maybe in China is more like, well, I don't really care. They have all my other information, so what? I don't know. True. I'm just saying, like, the different political climates are definitely create a different perspective.
So I think we could probably talk about this all afternoon, but we have come past the half an hour mark. And I don't think I've ever had so many, like I have a little pad of paper that I keep on the desk to write down my questions so I don't have to like keep them in my head while we're talking. And I don't think I've ever filled the page up quite as much as here, and I haven't asked half of them. But this was really fascinating, Marnie. It was so exciting to have you. Before we go, though, we'd like to go around and ask everybody to leave the audience with one thought, one thing that from the conversation they want to bring up, or one thing they haven't mentioned yet, or whatever it is. And just as a mean thing that I always do is I make the guests go first, so you have no.
You read my mind. I was thinking
about it. So, but on the other hand, it's a topic you know, so it's all okay. So, Marnie, what's one thing that you want to leave our audience with?
Maybe I need to end where we started.
Yeah.
Is that, we've talked about the science and the possibility, and we've also gone into the many ethical questions. And the thing that constantly amazes me and the thing that gives me hope is conversations like this one, where we can come together from different fields, different communities, and we can have this conversation and talk forever. It's amazing the opportunities people learn from each other. I learn, I think, more than I've ever shared, when we talk about genetics. That gives me so much hope. And yeah, so thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Absolutely. I will go next, but before I do that, Marnie, what is the best place for people to connect with you if they want to reach out to you?
Okay. And did you say I can write it in the chat?
Because
my email address is, good, you have it there. It's super long. But please can reach out to me at mgelbart@pged.med.harvard.edu. Our website is pged.org. Maybe we can put that in too.
I can tell
and I have LinkedIn, and I don't know what it is at the moment.
That's okay. People will find you on LinkedIn. Well, I will say
your name, they'll find you.
But at any rate, this has been a really amazing conversation. I think for me, back to building on your point about hope is, we are at sort of this interest. I think it's probably always true throughout human history that there's always this crossroads of that, some new technology can lead to great, amazing things. It can also lead to, bad things. And that it feels like if you sort of look at the arc of, human history over the long term, we always move in a positive direction over time. So hopefully some of the crazy things that we're seeing right now are temporary, and we will see that sort of arc continue. So that's mine. I will pass it over to Elena.
Yeah, so mine is from the healthcare data perspective, which is my world, and interesting to think about the intersection of genetic data and healthcare data, period. Because if you think about it, genetic is the most coveted one, right? It is the answer to every question, so to speak. So what are not just the benefit is obvious, right? But what are the frameworks, right? What is our way to guide our healthcare towards using this information constructively? And what's our way to protect this data so that society at large knows that it is enhancing rather than threatening?
Absolutely. So I actually have two things. One, just because, as a data-focused person, just the scale of this data and the fact that you could actually theoretically sequence everybody's, at least their basic genome. I guess if you go into like their internal genetic diversity and their gut bacteria or whatever, it gets much, much larger, but still, it's pretty interesting that we could actually understand human genomics on a sort of global population scale because of the cost. The other thing is just, it's just hard to get away from the complexity, the sheer complexity of the interaction between the ethics and science and what can be done, what is being done, the fact that there's always somebody who spoils it and makes it so we can't have nice things, on some level, and that the amazing things that we can do, even despite those limitations, is going to be quite amazing, even if precision medicine and personalized medicine is not last year. It will happen at some point, or we'll get closer and closer to that. So thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks,
Thank
Marnie.
you, Marnie.
Thank you.